My classmates called me a tryhard at coding, having no idea I'd already sold an app for 6 figures. The first time Garrett Finch called me a tryhard was in computer science class during my junior year. Mr. Holbrook had assigned us to build a simple calculator app as a weekend project, something that should take maybe 3 hours if you knew what you were doing. I finished mine in 40 minutes during lunch on Friday, added some extra features like scientific functions and a history log, then submitted it before the final bell. Monday morning, Garrett stood by my desk before class started, holding his phone with my submission pulled up on the class portal. He made sure everyone nearby could hear when he said that maybe I should try getting a life instead of spending my whole weekend brown-nosing the teacher with unnecessary features nobody asked for. His friends Kyle and Brendan laughed right on cue, and I just opened my textbook and pretended to read the same paragraph 5 times while my face burned. The thing was, I'd built and sold a productivity app called StreamTask to a major tech company for $375,000 when I was 15, 6 months before I even started at Riverside High. The money sat in a trust fund my parents had set up, earmarked for college and future investments, and the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed meant I couldn't tell anyone about the sale for 3 years. So when Garrett and his crew called me a try-hard for completing basic assignments efficiently, they had no idea I'd already done what most of them dreamed about doing someday. Garrett Finch was one of those kids who'd been coding since elementary school and made sure everyone knew it. He wore vintage Silicon Valley startup shirts and carried a laptop covered in programming language stickers, had strong opinions about which text editor was superior, and treated computer science class like it was his personal stage. Mr. Holbrook loved him because Garrett asked questions that sounded smart and always volunteered to demo his projects first. What Mr. Holbrook didn't see was how Garrett formed this toxic hierarchy in the class where he and his 2 friends, Kyle and Brendan, decided who was a real programmer and who was just pretending. They'd made it clear from day one that I was in the pretending category, that I was trying too hard to seem competent when I should just accept my place as a mediocre coder who got lucky with good grades. The irony was that StreamTask had been featured in Tech Insider magazine and had 50,000 active users before I sold it, but I couldn't say any of that without violating the NDA and potentially losing the deal's back-end royalties. So I just took their insults and kept my head down, counting the months until the NDA expired, and I could finally tell the truth. The breaking point came in November when Mr. Holbrook announced the winter project competition. We had 6 weeks to build any application we wanted, working solo or in teams of up to 3 people. The winner would get their project showcased at the district STEM fair and receive a recommendation letter from Mr. Holbrook for their college applications. Garrett immediately announced he was building an AI-powered study companion app that would revolutionize how students learned. He recruited Kyle and Brendan as his team and spent the next week telling anyone who'd listen about their innovative features and cutting-edge architecture. Meanwhile, I'd been sitting on an idea for months that I couldn't pursue while StreamTask was in active development, a collaborative coding platform for high school students that would make pair programming and project management actually accessible instead of overwhelming. I knew exactly how to build it because I'd identified the need while working on StreamTask and had spent months sketching out the technical architecture. I registered my project as Solo and titled it Code Bridge, keeping the description vague because I didn't want Garrett and his friends dissecting my idea before I'd even started building. The first week of development, I stayed after school in the computer lab every day until the janitor kicked me out at 6. I'd set up the basic back-end infrastructure and started building the real-time collaboration features that would be the app's core functionality. Thursday afternoon, I was deep in debugging a WebSocket connection issue when Garrett walked past my computer and stopped. He leaned over my shoulder without asking permission and watched my screen for a solid 30 seconds while I kept typing, trying to ignore him. He finally laughed and said out loud to Kyle, who was across the room, that I was building some kind of janky chat app like it was 2010 and AM was still relevant. Kyle came over to look and made a show of cringing at my code, pointing out that my variable naming conventions were inconsistent and my comment formatting was messy. Brendan joined them, and the 3 of them stood around my computer, offering unsolicited critique, while other students watched. I closed my laptop and told them I was done for the day, packed my stuff while they were still making jokes about my alleged lack of coding standards, and left the lab feeling like I wanted to punch something. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. rewriting sections of code that were perfectly functional just because their comments had gotten in my head. My best friend Zara was the only person who knew about StreamTask and the NDA. We'd been friends since middle school when we were both in the robotics club, and she was the one person I trusted completely to keep the secret. She was taking AP Art instead of computer science, so she didn't have to deal with Garrett's hierarchy, but she saw how it affected me. Friday during lunch, I told her about the computer lab incident, and she immediately got angry on my behalf. She said I should just tell Garrett about StreamTask and watch his face implode, but I explained again that the NDA was legally binding until February, and violating it would cost me not just the initial payment, but also the quarterly royalties that had been adding up. Zara asked what the royalties were currently worth, and I told her they'd been averaging about $5,000 per quarter, which meant I'd made an additional $60,000 since the initial sale. Her jaw literally dropped, and she said she couldn't believe I was sitting on almost $500,000, while Garrett Finch called me a tryhard for writing clean code. I told her I only had to wait 3 more months, and then the NDA would expire, and I could say whatever I wanted. She made me promise that when February came, I'd make the reveal spectacular enough to be worth the wait. CodeBridge started taking shape faster than I'd expected. By week 3, I had the core collaboration features working, and had begun implementing the project management tools that would differentiate it from existing platforms. I'd designed the whole interface to be intuitive for beginners while still offering advanced features for experienced programmers, and I was genuinely proud of what I was building. The only problem was that every time I worked on it in the computer lab, Garrett and his friends found new ways to mock my progress. They'd screenshot my code and point out style choices they disagreed with, even though my code was functional and well documented. They'd ask in fake, concerned voices if I needed help understanding certain concepts, then explain things I already knew in condescending detail. The worst part was that other students started joining in, sensing that making fun of me was socially safe because Garrett had marked me as a target. Kids who'd never written a line of code in their lives felt comfortable commenting that my project looked basic or unsophisticated because Garrett had established that as the acceptable opinion. I started working on CodeBridge exclusively at home to avoid the daily humiliation, only using the school computers when Mr. Holbrook required in-class work sessions. December brought the first project milestone check-in where Mr. Holbrook would review everyone's progress and provide feedback. We had to demo our applications in their current state and explain our development plans for the remaining 3 weeks. Garrett's team went first and showcased their AI study companion with a slick presentation and confident explanations of their machine learning models. Mr. Holbrook was clearly impressed, asking detailed technical questions that Garrett answered smoothly. The app looked polished in the demo, though I noticed they were showing mostly front-end mock-ups with limited actual functionality. When it was my turn, I pulled up CodeBridge and walked through the real-time collaboration features, showing how 2 users could edit code simultaneously with conflict resolution and integrated voice chat. I demonstrated the project board system and the code review tools I'd built, explaining how they addressed specific pain points I'd identified in existing platforms. Mr. Holbrook asked several questions about my technical implementation and seemed genuinely interested in the application's potential. Then Garrett raised his hand and asked in front of the whole class if I'd considered that tools like this already existed, and I was basically rebuilding GitHub Classroom without understanding what made GitHub actually good. Other students laughed, and I felt my face get hot. I said CodeBridge was focused on accessibility and lowering barriers to entry for high school students, which existing platforms failed to address adequately. Garrett smirked and said that sounded like a complicated way to admit I couldn't compete with real developers. That afternoon, I was in the school library trying to work on an English essay when my phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had created a private Instagram account called Riverside CS Rankings and had posted a tier list of everyone in our computer science class. Garrett, Kyle, and Brendan were in the S tier labeled Real Programmers. A handful of other students were scattered through A and B tiers. I was in F tier along with 3 other students, under a category labeled Tryhards and Frauds. The account had already gained 30 followers, all from our school. The post included a caption explaining that F tier represented students who worked hard but lacked natural talent and should probably consider other career paths. My hands were shaking as I screenshotted the post and showed Zara, who immediately reported the account to Instagram and told me to do the same. The account was taken down within 2 hours, but the damage was done. Everyone in computer science had seen it, and now the tier list was being referenced in class like an established fact. Students who'd previously been neutral toward me started treating me differently, like Garrett's public ranking had given them permission to dismiss my work. When I tried to participate in a class discussion about API design the next day, Kyle literally laughed and said maybe I should let the S tier handle the complex concepts. Mr. Holbrook told him to be respectful, but didn't actually address the underlying hierarchy that was poisoning his classroom. The winter project deadline was January 15th, which gave us 3 weeks after winter break to finish our applications. I spent most of break locked in my room working on CodeBridge, adding features and polishing the user experience until it was something I was genuinely proud of. I recorded a demo video showing all the functionality and wrote comprehensive documentation explaining the technical architecture. My parents kept asking if I was okay because I barely left the house except for mandatory family events, but I couldn't explain that I was trying to build something good enough to prove myself to people who'd already decided I wasn't worth respecting. Zara came over 3 days before school started again and forced me to take a break. We drove to this hiking trail outside of town and walked for 2 hours while she made me talk about something other than code. She asked if the competition was even worth this much stress, and I told her it wasn't really about the competition anymore. It was about proving that Garrett's ranking was wrong, that I belonged in computer science and deserved to be there just as much as anyone else. She said I was letting him get too far into my head, and I needed to remember that his opinion didn't define my worth. I knew she was right. but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were completely different things. School started again on January 3rd, and the computer lab immediately felt hostile. Garrett's team had apparently also worked through break because their AI study companion had several new features and a redesigned interface. They were showing it off to other students before class, and I heard multiple people say it looked professional enough to actually launch. When Mr. Holbrook walked in and saw the crowd around Garrett's laptop, he came over to look and spent 10 minutes praising their progress. Nobody asked to see CodeBridge, and I didn't offer to show it. During the classwork session, I focused on final bug fixes and optimization, trying to ignore the periodic glances and whispered comments from Garrett's corner of the lab. At one point, Kyle's voice carried across the room saying he'd heard I was building a group project platform, which was hilarious because nobody would ever want to work with me on a group project. The other students within earshot laughed, and I kept my eyes on my screen and my hands on my keyboard and told myself I only had to get through 12 more days until the deadline. Then the NDA would expire on February 1st, and I could finally tell everyone about StreamTask and watch their faces change when they realized who they'd been dismissing for 6 months. The week before the deadline, Mr. Holbrook announced that instead of just submitting our projects digitally, we'd be doing live presentations to a panel of judges. He'd invited 2 software engineers from local tech companies and the district STEM coordinator to evaluate our projects and choose the winner. The presentations would happen on Friday, January 14th, during an extended class period. Garrett immediately started talking about preparing a pitch deck and rehearsing their presentation like they were on Shark Tank. I felt sick because I was good at writing code, but terrible at presenting in front of people, especially when those people included classmates who'd spent months undermining my confidence. That night, I wrote and rewrote my presentation script until 2 a.m, trying to find the right balance between technical detail and accessible explanation. I practiced delivering it to my bathroom mirror and hated how nervous I sounded, how my voice shook on certain words, how I couldn't maintain eye contact with my own reflection. I texted Zara asking if she could skip her AP art class to sit in the audience during presentations, and she responded immediately saying she'd already cleared it with her teacher because she knew I'd need moral support. Presentation day arrived with the kind of gray winter weather that matched my mood exactly. The computer lab had been rearranged with chairs set up theater-style facing the front, where a projector displayed a title slide reading Riverside High CS Winter Project Showcase. The 3 judges sat in the front row with Mr. Holbrook holding scoring rubrics and looking professional. Students filed in talking and laughing, and I saw Zara slip in the back and give me a thumbs up. Garrett's team presented first and delivered exactly the kind of polished performance I'd expected. They had slick slides, confident delivery, and demonstrated their AI study companion with what looked like well-rehearsed scenarios. The judges asked questions about their machine learning models and data training, and Garrett answered smoothly with technical language that sounded impressive, even if I suspected some of it was vague hand-waving. The judges nodded and took notes and looked impressed. Kyle and Brendan played their supporting roles perfectly, jumping in with relevant details at the right moments. The presentation ended with the judges applauding and Mr. Holbrook beaming like a proud parent. 3 other teams presented before my turn, all showing competent but unremarkable projects. By the time Mr. Holbrook called my name, I felt like I might throw up. I walked to the front with my laptop while Garrett whispered something to Kyle that made them both snicker. I connected to the projector and pulled up my presentation, took a breath, and started talking. My voice came out steadier than I'd expected as I introduced CodeBridge and explained the problem it solved. I walked through the technical architecture, showing the real-time collaboration features and demonstrating how the conflict resolution worked when 2 users edited simultaneously. I showed the integrated project management tools and the code review system with inline commenting. The judges started asking questions, and I answered them, feeling my confidence grow as I talked about design decisions and implementation challenges. One of the software engineers, a woman named Diana Kim, seemed particularly interested in how I'd handled WebSocket scaling and asked several detailed technical questions. I was explaining my caching strategy when Garrett raised his hand. Mr. Holbrook told him to hold his questions until the Q&A portion, but Garrett just asked anyway. He wanted to know where I'd gotten the idea for CodeBridge, because it seemed similar to several existing platforms, and was I just copying features from GitHub and Discord without really understanding the underlying technical complexity? The room went quiet, and I felt everyone's eyes on me. Diana Kim looked annoyed at the interruption and said that was hardly a relevant question for judging, that iterating on existing solutions with improved accessibility was literally how technology progressed. But the damage was done. I could see other students nodding along with Garrett's implication that I was just copying rather than creating. I finished my presentation mechanically, no longer feeling any of the confidence I'd had moments before. When I sat back down, Zara caught my eye and mouthed that I'd done great, but I barely registered it. The remaining presentations blurred together, and I didn't process any of them. When everyone had finished, Mr. Holbrook thanked the judges and said they'd deliberate during lunch and announce the winner at the start of afternoon classes. He dismissed us and students filed out in groups, already discussing who they thought would win. I heard multiple people confidently predicting Garrett's team, saying their app was the most innovative and well-executed. Nobody mentioned CodeBridge, and I tried not to care. Zara found me in the cafeteria and forced me to eat something even though I had no appetite. She said my presentation was genuinely good and the judges seemed impressed, especially Diana. I told her it didn't matter because Garrett had already poisoned everyone against me. And even if the judges liked my project, Mr. Holbrook's opinion carried weight, and he clearly favored Garrett. Zara said I was catastrophizing and I needed to wait for the actual results before assuming the worst. We were still talking when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was Diana Kim, and the subject line read CodeBridge and Future Opportunities. I opened it right there at the lunch table and read it twice to make sure I was understanding correctly. Diana explained that she was a senior engineer at a company called Pathfinder Technologies that built educational software. She'd been impressed by CodeBridge during my presentation and wanted to know if I'd be interested in discussing the project further, potentially as an internship opportunity for the summer or even as the foundation for a commercial product. She included her phone number and suggested we set up a call to discuss details. I showed Zara the email, and she literally screamed, making everyone in the cafeteria turn to look at us. She grabbed my shoulders and shook me while yelling that this was huge, that a real tech company wanted to talk to me about my project. I felt dizzy trying to process what this meant. The afternoon computer science class started with Mr. Holbrook bringing the 3 judges back to the lab to announce the results. Everyone settled into their seats, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Mr. Holbrook gave a speech about how impressed the judges were with the overall quality of projects and how difficult the decision had been. Then he announced that the winner of the Winter Project competition was Garrett Finch, Kyle Reeves, and Brendan Wu for their AI Study Companion application. The class erupted in applause, and Garrett stood up to shake hands with the judges, looking smug and vindicated. Mr. Holbrook explained that while several projects had shown technical merit, the judges felt Garrett's team had demonstrated the most innovative application of emerging technologies, combined with clear commercial potential. Diana Kim looked uncomfortable during this announcement, and I noticed she didn't applaud. When the celebration died down, she asked if she could say something. Mr. Holbrook looked surprised but nodded. Diana stood and addressed the class, saying that while the winning project was impressive, she wanted to highlight that innovation came in many forms. She specifically mentioned CodeBridge as an example of a project that showed deep understanding of user needs and elegant solutions to real problems, and encouraged me to continue developing it. A few people glanced my way, but most were still focused on congratulating Garrett and his team. The judges left, and Mr. Holbrook dismissed class early so the winners could celebrate. I left the building without talking to anyone and drove home in a fog. The logical part of my brain knew that Diana's email was objectively more significant than winning a high school competition. A real tech company's senior engineer had reached out about potentially commercializing my project. That was huge. But emotionally, I just felt like I'd lost to Garrett again, like the months of work and humiliation had been for nothing because he'd still ended up on top. I sat in my car in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. My mom found me in my room an hour later, lying on my bed staring at the ceiling. She asked how the presentation went, and I told her I'd lost to Garrett, but got an email from a judge about potential opportunities. She sat on the edge of my bed and said that sometimes not winning was actually winning in disguise, that the right people noticing your work mattered more than a popularity contest, judged partly by a teacher who played favorites. I told her about the NDA expiring in 2 weeks and asked if she thought I should even bother telling anyone about StreamTask or if it would just look like sour grapes at this point. She said the truth was the truth regardless of timing, and I'd earned the right to be proud of my accomplishments, even if it made other people uncomfortable. The next 2 weeks crawled by with Garrett's win being the dominant topic in computer science. Mr. Holbrook devoted class time to helping Garrett's team prepare their presentation for the district STEM fair and largely ignored the other projects. I stopped participating in class discussions and just focused on completing assignments, counting down the days until February 1st, when the NDA would expire and I could finally speak freely about StreamTask. I'd been going back and forth on whether to say anything publicly or just let it stay private knowledge, but every time Garrett made another comment about tryhards or Brendan smirked when I answered a question in class, my resolve hardened. I was going to tell everyone about StreamTask, and I was going to do it in a way that made the truth impossible to dismiss or minimize. Zara had been pushing me to make it dramatic, to plan some kind of public reveal that would maximize the impact. We spent hours brainstorming different approaches, from a carefully crafted social media post to somehow working it into a class presentation. Finally, I decided on something that felt right. I would update my LinkedIn profile on February 1st with all the StreamTask details, then share it to every social media platform I had with a simple caption explaining that I could finally talk about this publicly. February 1st fell on a Wednesday. I woke up early and spent an hour before school updating my LinkedIn profile with a detailed work experience section about developing and selling StreamTask. I included the sale price because Zara had convinced me that being specific made it real in a way that vague statements didn't. I wrote about the app's features, its user base, the development process, and what I'd learned from the experience. Then I took screenshots of the Tech Insider article that had featured StreamTask when it was still under my name, of the user reviews, of the press release about the acquisition. I compiled everything into a Twitter thread with receipts for every claim, cross-posted it to Instagram and Facebook, and tagged it with Riverside High so students from my school would see it. I wrote a caption explaining that I'd been under NDA until today and was excited to finally share this accomplishment. Then I hit post at 7:30 a.m. and immediately felt like I might throw up from nerves and adrenaline. I turned off my phone and drove to school, telling myself I wouldn't check the responses until lunch. I made it until third period before my curiosity won, and I pulled out my phone in the bathroom between classes. The posts had exploded. My Twitter thread had 300 retweets and 500 likes. The Instagram post had 250 likes and 40 comments. People from school were tagging their friends, sharing screenshots, arguing in my comments about whether it was real. Several people had found and shared the original Tech Insider article, confirming that StreamTask was indeed developed by someone with my real name. Garrett had commented on my Instagram post saying "source" with a laughing emoji, and 5 people had responded to him with links to the article and other verification. Someone had created a new post comparing my StreamTask sale to Garrett's winter project win, pointing out that I'd literally sold an app for hundreds of thousands of dollars before even starting high school. Zara had commented a string of fire emojis and, finally, in all caps. I was still scrolling through responses when the first bell rang for fourth period. I walked into computer science, with my phone still in my hand, and saw that half the class was already there, clustered in small groups talking and looking at their phones. The conversation stopped when I walked in and everyone turned to stare at me. Garrett was standing by his desk with his laptop open, presumably having just looked up my posts. His face was red, and his jaw was tight, and he didn't say anything as I walked past him to my seat. Mr. Holbrook started class by asking everyone to put phones away and focus, but the energy in the room was completely different from normal. People kept glancing at me and whispering to each other. Kyle passed a note to Brendan, who read it and looked over at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Halfway through Mr. Holbrook's lecture about database optimization, Garrett raised his hand. He asked if we could take a few minutes to discuss something relevant to the class, since apparently we had a celebrity entrepreneur among us who'd been hiding his success. Mr. Holbrook looked confused and asked what Garrett meant. Garrett pulled up my Twitter thread on his laptop and turned it around to show the teacher, explaining that I'd just revealed I'd sold an app for $375,000 before starting at Riverside High. The class erupted in conversation, and Mr. Holbrook held up his hand for quiet while he read through my posts. His face went through several expressions as he scrolled, landing on something between surprise and concern. He looked at me and asked if this was accurate, if I'd really developed and sold a productivity app as a high school freshman. I said yes, and that I'd been under NDA until today, which is why I hadn't mentioned it before. The class went completely silent. Mr. Holbrook seemed unsure how to proceed. He said this was certainly impressive and congratulations on my success, but we needed to return to the day's lesson plan. Garrett interrupted and said he thought it was relevant to discuss because it raised questions about the winter project competition. If I'd already developed and sold a commercial application, did I have an unfair advantage in the competition? Should I have been competing against students who were still learning when I apparently had professional-level experience? Several students nodded in agreement, and I felt my face get hot. Diana Kim's email suddenly made more sense in this context. She'd recognized professional-level work because it was professional-level work. But Garrett was trying to reframe my experience as cheating rather than achievement, and I could see some students buying into that narrative. I raised my hand, and Mr. Holbrook called on me looking relieved to shift the conversation. I explained that having experience didn't make me a cheater any more than Garrett's years of childhood coding made him a cheater. The competition was about building a project in 6 weeks with current skills, and everyone had brought their current skills to it, regardless of their background. The fact that my skills were more developed because I'd invested years of work didn't invalidate my participation. The debate continued for the rest of class with students taking sides. Some thought I should have disclosed my background before the competition, that hiding it was deceptive even if technically allowed. Others argued that there was no rule requiring disclosure of previous experience, and Garrett was just bitter that his winner status now looked less impressive in comparison. A few students started questioning whether Garrett's team had really deserved to win if my technically superior project had lost to what was essentially a popularity contest. Mr. Holbrook looked increasingly uncomfortable, and finally shut down the discussion by saying the competition results were final and everyone had followed the stated rules. But I could tell the conversation wasn't over. At lunch, Zara found me and reported that my posts were spreading beyond just our school. She'd seen them shared in several local tech community groups, and someone had posted them to Reddit's R programming subreddit where they were gaining traction. Her phone showed me the Reddit thread, which had over 500 upvotes and 200 comments. Most were positive, praising my accomplishment, and criticizing what they saw as my classmates' tall guy syndrome. Several commenters with professional software engineering backgrounds were analyzing the technical details I'd shared about StreamTask's architecture and confirming it showed genuine expertise. One comment with 300 upvotes read, "This kid built and sold a real product with active users while his classmates were still figuring out Hello World, and they called him a try-hard. The cognitive dissonance is chef's kiss." The next day, the local tech news blog picked up the story. Their headline read, "Riverside High student kept six-figure app sale secret for 3 years due to NDA." The article interviewed me over email, asking about the development process, the NDA experience, and how it felt keeping such a significant achievement private. I explained the situation carefully, focusing on my own experience rather than attacking anyone else, but I did mention feeling isolated by not being able to share my background when classmates dismissed my abilities. The article went semi-viral in regional tech circles, and by Friday, I'd received interview requests from 3 different podcasts and a request to speak at a local tech meetup. My LinkedIn connection requests had jumped from 25 to over 300, most from people in the tech industry, offering advice, opportunities, or just congratulations. Garrett hadn't spoken to me since Wednesday, but I'd overheard him telling Kyle that the whole thing was overhyped, that selling one app didn't make someone a genius, that plenty of people got lucky with viral products. Kyle had agreed enthusiastically, but I noticed Brendan hadn't joined the conversation and had actually liked one of my Instagram posts, which felt significant. The district STEM fair was the following Saturday, and Garrett's team was representing Riverside High with their AI study companion. I hadn't planned to attend, but Zara convinced me to go as moral support for some friends from her AP art class who had projects displaying. We walked through the gymnasium looking at projects from different schools, stopping to talk to people we knew. I saw Mr. Holbrook near the computer science section with Garrett, Kyle, and Brendan, helping them set up their display. Their project board looked professional with printed screenshots and technical diagrams. Other students and parents were already gathering to see their demo. Then, I noticed Diana Kim walking through the gym with 2 other people I didn't recognize, all wearing Pathfinder Technologies name badges. She saw me and waved, walking over with a smile. She introduced her colleagues as the company's CTO and head of product, explaining they'd come to scout interesting student projects. She asked if I'd had a chance to think about her email and whether I'd be interested in discussing CodeBridge further. I said yes, absolutely, and she handed me her business card saying to call her Monday to set up a proper meeting. Her CTO mentioned he'd seen the articles about StreamTask and was impressed by both the technical execution and the maturity I'd shown in handling the NDA situation. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about my development process and future plans before they excused themselves to continue looking at projects. I watched them walk toward the computer science section where Garrett's team was set up. They stopped at several projects before reaching Garrett's, spending a few minutes watching his demo and asking questions. From my position across the gym, I could see Garrett's animated presentation style and the Pathfinder team's polite but not particularly enthusiastic responses. They moved on after about 5 minutes, which I knew from experience was less time than they'd spent talking to me. Zara elbowed me and said karma was real, and I was watching it happen in real time. We left before the judges announced awards because I didn't want to make the day about me versus Garrett, but Zara texted me later that evening that Garrett's team had taken 2nd place in their category. The winner was a senior from another school who'd built an accessibility app for students with visual impairments. The text included a photo Zara had sneakily taken of Garrett's face during the announcement, and I had to admit, he looked devastated. I felt a moment of something like sympathy, understanding how much losing hurt when you'd been confident in winning before remembering all the times he'd made me feel worthless in computer science class. The sympathy faded pretty quickly. Monday after school, I drove to a coffee shop near downtown for my meeting with Diana Kim. She'd brought the CTO and head of product from the STEM fair, and we sat in a corner booth while they asked detailed questions about CodeBridge's architecture and my vision for its development. They explained that Pathfinder Technologies specialized in educational software and had been looking to expand into the collaborative learning space. CodeBridge aligned almost perfectly with their strategic goals, and they saw potential to develop it into a commercial product for high schools and potentially colleges. The CTO asked if I'd be interested in either selling the project outright or doing a partnership where I'd continue developing it with their resources and guidance. I'd learned from the StreamTask experience that I needed to think carefully about these decisions rather than jumping at the first offer, so I told them I was definitely interested but wanted to understand all the options before committing. We spent 2 hours discussing different scenarios, from a full acquisition to a development partnership to a summer internship where I'd work on CodeBridge as part of their product team. By the end of the meeting, they'd sent me home with a formal proposal document to review with my parents and told me to take as much time as I needed to decide. The news about Pathfinder Technologies' interest in CodeBridge spread through school faster than my StreamTask reveal had. Someone had seen us at the coffee shop and posted a photo to Instagram asking if I was in a business meeting, and within a day, everyone seemed to know a tech company was interested in my winter project. The narrative around the competition results shifted dramatically. Students who'd accepted Garrett's win as deserved started questioning whether the judges had made a mistake, whether Mr. Holbrook's favoritism had influenced the outcome, whether Garrett's project was actually as innovative as everyone had thought. I heard multiple conversations in the hallway debating whether an AI study companion that used pre-trained models was really more impressive than a collaborative platform with custom architecture built from scratch. Garrett's victory started looking less like validation of his superiority and more like a popularity contest that had gotten the results wrong. The Instagram account Riverside CS Rankings had been recreated by someone else with a new tier list. This time I was in S tier under a category labeled Actual Professional Developers, while Garrett, Kyle, and Brendan were in B tier labeled Competent but Overconfident. The account tagged them in the post with a caption suggesting they might want to reconsider their assessment of who was a try-hard. Things got worse for Garrett when one of the software engineer judges, a guy named Christopher Vega, posted on LinkedIn about the winter project competition. He'd written a long piece about the challenges of judging student work and had included a paragraph that didn't name names, but was obviously about CodeBridge versus Garrett's project. He explained that sometimes judges had to choose between technically impressive work that showed depth of understanding versus flashy presentations that looked good but had questionable underlying implementation. He admitted that in retrospect, he thought they'd weighted presentation skills too heavily and hadn't done enough technical digging to evaluate whether projects were built on solid foundations or clever shortcuts. The post gained traction in local tech communities, and someone from Riverside High shared it to our school's general Instagram with a caption asking if this was shade toward Mr. Holbrook's favorite students. Comments filled with students saying they'd known all along that Garrett's team had won on charm rather than substance. I saw the post and felt a complicated mix of vindication and discomfort. I'd wanted people to recognize that Garrett's dismissal of my abilities was wrong, but I hadn't wanted to completely destroy his reputation in the process. By mid-February, the social dynamics in computer science had completely flipped. Students who'd previously ignored me started trying to partner with me for assignments. People asked questions about my development process and wanted advice on their own projects. Kyle and Brendan stopped hanging around Garrett as much, sitting in different parts of the lab and working independently. Garrett himself became withdrawn and quiet, no longer dominating class discussions or offering unsolicited opinions on other people's code. Mr. Holbrook seemed aware of the shift, but didn't acknowledge it directly. Instead, trying to maintain normalcy by sticking rigidly to his lesson plans. The weirdest change was that students started treating me like some kind of coding authority, asking me to review their work and explain concepts they were struggling with. I tried to be helpful without being condescending, remembering how it felt when Garrett had used his perceived expertise as a weapon. But I could tell that my sudden elevation made some people uncomfortable, like they resented having to recognize my abilities after months of dismissing them. The situation came to a head in late February during a class discussion about career paths in technology. Mr. Holbrook had asked students to share their goals and explain how they planned to achieve them. Several students talked about wanting to work for major tech companies or start their own businesses. When it was Garrett's turn, he said he was planning to study computer science in college and hopefully land an internship at a good company during his undergraduate years. His voice lacked its usual confidence, and I noticed he didn't make eye contact with anyone while talking. Then Mr. Holbrook called on me, and I felt everyone's attention shift. I said my immediate goal was finishing high school and deciding what to do about Pathfinder Technology's offer. Longer term, I wanted to keep building products that solved real problems for real users, whether that meant working for a company or continuing to develop my own applications. I mentioned that the StreamTask experience had taught me I was more interested in the building process than the business side, so I'd probably end up as an engineer rather than an entrepreneur. Garrett's hand shot up and Mr. Holbrook called on him, looking nervous. Garrett asked if I ever felt weird about being so far ahead of everyone else, if it was lonely being the only person in class with professional experience. The question caught me off guard because it was the first direct interaction we'd had in weeks. I thought about how to answer honestly without being cruel. I said that being unable to talk about StreamTask for 3 years had definitely been isolating, especially when people dismissed my abilities without knowing my background. But I also said that having professional experience didn't make me better than anyone else, just differently experienced. Everyone in the class was at their own point in their learning journey, and the goal wasn't to rank ourselves against each other, but to help each other grow. I looked directly at Garrett when I said that using expertise as a weapon to put others down was toxic, but so was using success as a weapon to retroactively prove you'd always been superior. What mattered was building things you were proud of and treating other people with respect, regardless of their skill level. The class was completely quiet, and I could see several students nodding. Garrett's face was unreadable, but he didn't look angry, just tired. After class, he stopped by my desk while I was packing up and asked if we could talk. I said sure, expecting some kind of confrontation, but he just stood there for a minute looking at the floor before finally speaking. He said he was sorry for how he'd treated me, that he'd been insecure about his own abilities, and had dealt with it by tearing down anyone who threatened his position as the top student. He said, watching me get opportunities with Pathfinder Technologies while he got second place at the STEM fair had forced him to confront the fact that he'd based his entire identity on being the best coder in the room, and learning he'd never actually been the best was devastating. I told Garrett I accepted his apology, but that understanding where his behavior came from didn't erase the impact it had had on me. I explained that months of daily humiliation and dismissal had done real damage to my confidence and my enjoyment of coding, that I'd started to doubt my own abilities despite having literal proof of my competence. I said I appreciated him taking responsibility, but he needed to understand that saying sorry didn't automatically fix everything or entitle him to forgiveness. He nodded and said he wasn't expecting instant forgiveness, just wanted to acknowledge he'd been wrong and try to do better going forward. We stood there in the empty classroom for another minute in awkward silence before Brendan appeared in the doorway. He said Kyle was waiting outside and they were all going to get food if I wanted to come. I was surprised by the invitation but said yes, figuring that if Garrett was genuinely trying to change, I could at least give him a chance to prove it. We ended up at a burger place near school where the conversation was stilted at first, but gradually became more natural. Kyle apologized too, saying he'd gone along with Garrett because it was easier than standing up to him, but he regretted not questioning the hierarchy they'd created. Brendan admitted he'd felt uncomfortable with how they'd treated me, but hadn't known how to address it without becoming a target himself. Over the next few weeks, something strange happened. Garrett and I didn't become friends exactly, but we developed a working relationship that was actually productive. We ended up as partners for a class project about database design, and I was surprised to find that when he wasn't trying to prove his superiority, he was actually a competent programmer with good ideas. We split the work evenly and both contributed meaningfully to the final product. Other students noticed the shift, and the toxic competitive atmosphere in computer science gradually dissipated, replaced by something closer to actual collaboration. Mr. Holbrook seemed relieved by the change and started structuring classes to encourage teamwork rather than individual competition. He also pulled me aside one day to apologize for not addressing Garrett's behavior earlier, admitting he'd recognized the problem but hadn't known how to intervene without making it worse. I told him that acknowledging it now was better than never acknowledging it, and suggested he consider implementing clearer anti-bullying policies for future classes. He actually took my feedback seriously and introduced a classroom conduct agreement the following month that explicitly prohibited putting down other students' work or abilities. I signed the partnership deal with Pathfinder Technologies in March. After weeks of discussions with my parents and reviewing multiple versions of the contract, we agreed on an arrangement where I'd maintain creative control over CodeBridge, while Pathfinder provided resources, infrastructure, and business guidance to turn it into a commercial product. They'd hire me as a part-time developer during the school year and full-time during the summer, paying me a salary plus equity in the project. The deal wasn't as financially dramatic as the StreamTask sale, but it was structured to be sustainable long-term rather than a one-time payment. My parents helped me set up a proper business entity and separate bank account so I could manage the income appropriately. When the deal was finalized, I posted about it on social media with a more measured tone than my StreamTask reveal, focusing on excitement about the opportunity rather than proving anything to anyone. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with current and former classmates congratulating me and several teachers commenting about being proud of my success. Garrett liked the post and left a comment saying the tech industry was lucky to have developers who actually cared about solving problems instead of just chasing clout. I appreciated the acknowledgement, even though part of me noted the irony of him saying that after months of chasing clout himself. Senior year started with me splitting time between school and remote work for Pathfinder Technologies. I'd rearranged my schedule to take morning classes and work from home in the afternoons, developing CodeBridge into a full-fledged platform. The company had assembled a small team around the project, and I was collaborating with professional designers and product managers to refine the user experience and add features I'd never have been able to build alone. CodeBridge launched in beta to 50 high schools across 3 states in October, and the initial feedback was incredibly positive. Teachers reported that their students were engaging more deeply with programming assignments because the collaborative features made it less intimidating to ask for help. Students liked the interface and said it was more intuitive than existing options. The validation of seeing my work actually helping people was different from the satisfaction of selling StreamTask. This felt more meaningful because I was staying involved in the product's evolution instead of just handing it off and walking away. Garrett ended up applying early decision to Carnegie Mellon's computer science program and got in December. When he found out, he was genuinely excited in a way I hadn't seen since before the winter project competition. We were in the computer lab when he got the acceptance email, and he actually jumped out of his chair and yelled before catching himself and looking embarrassed. I congratulated him and meant it, knowing that Carnegie Mellon was his dream school and that getting in was a huge accomplishment regardless of everything else that had happened. He thanked me and said he'd been worried his second-place finish at the STEM fair would hurt his chances, but apparently the rest of his application had been strong enough to compensate. Kyle got into Georgia Tech, and Brendan got into UC Berkeley, and computer science class became less tense as everyone focused on finishing senior year and preparing for college. The hierarchy that had dominated junior year felt like ancient history, replaced by a strange sense of camaraderie among students who'd once been rivals. My college decision process was complicated by the fact that I was already working professionally and making decent money. I'd gotten into several good engineering programs, but I was torn about whether traditional college was the right path when I already had a career trajectory that didn't require a degree. My parents pushed for college as a backup plan and for the general education and social experience, arguing that I could always return to development work but couldn't easily go back and get a degree later. Zara, who'd gotten into Rhode Island School of Design for Art, said I'd regret missing the college experience and that learning from professors and classmates would make me a better developer even if I already had practical skills. After months of deliberation, I committed to Stanford's computer science program with a plan to continue working part-time for Pathfinder Technologies remotely. The company supported this decision and said they'd work around my academic schedule, recognizing that long-term I'd be more valuable with both formal education and practical experience. Graduation came in May with the usual ceremonies and celebrations. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, while my parents took approximately 800 photos. At the senior awards ceremony, Mr. Holbrook gave me the Computer Science Achievement Award, which felt ironic given how much of junior year he'd overlooked Garrett's behavior, but I accepted it graciously and gave a short speech thanking him for running the program and encouraging students to pursue their interests in technology. I specifically mentioned that the winter project competition, despite its controversial outcome, had pushed me to build something I was genuinely proud of, and that had led to real opportunities. I saw Garrett in the audience, and he was clapping along with everyone else, no longer looking bitter when my accomplishments were acknowledged. After the ceremony, we ended up in the same group of people taking photos, and someone suggested we take one together since we'd both be studying computer science next year. The photo captured something interesting. Two students who'd been adversaries for a year, both smiling genuinely, both heading toward futures in the same field, both having learned something about humility and respect through a painful process. The summer before college, I worked full-time at Pathfinder Technologies in their downtown office. CodeBridge officially launched to over 200 schools, and we hit 10,000 active users by July. I was invited to speak at 2 education technology conferences about building tools for student collaboration, and I got to meet other young developers who were solving similar problems in different domains. The experience of being surrounded by people who took my work seriously and treated me as a peer rather than an upstart was healing in ways I hadn't expected. I realized how much energy I'd spent in high school just trying to prove I deserved to be in the room, and how much more productive I could be when that wasn't necessary. Diana Kim became something like a mentor, meeting with me regularly to discuss both technical challenges and career development. She shared her own experiences being dismissed early in her career and encouraged me to use my platform to make the tech industry more welcoming for young people who didn't fit the traditional mold. I kept in touch with Garrett through social media and occasional messages. He'd post about his summer internship at a startup in Pittsburgh, and I'd post about CodeBridge development, and we'd exchange comments that were supportive without being overly familiar. It felt like we'd reached a detente where we could acknowledge each other's successes without competition or resentment. Zara said this was character growth for both of us, and that she was proud we'd managed to move past the worst of the conflict. She was spending her summer at an art-intensive program and sending me photos of her work, abstract pieces that she said were inspired by themes of identity and recognition. When I asked what that meant, she said it was about the difference between how people saw you and who you actually were, and how much pain lived in that gap. I told her she was getting too philosophical for text messages, and we should discuss it over video call. We ended up talking for 2 hours about art and code, and how both were ultimately about communication and connection. College started in September, and I arrived at Stanford both excited and nervous. I'd requested a single dorm room so I'd have space to work on CodeBridge without disturbing a roommate, and I'd set up my desk with multiple monitors and all my development tools before even unpacking my clothes. My parents had driven me down from Oregon and spent the day helping me settle in before leaving me with approximately 300 reminders to eat properly and sleep enough and not forget I was a college student, not just a developer. The first week was orientation activities and getting to know other students in my dorm and classes. When people asked about my background, I gave them the short version about selling StreamTask and currently working on CodeBridge with Pathfinder Technologies. Most people were impressed but not weird about it, treating it as interesting information rather than defining my entire identity. A few students had actually used CodeBridge in their high schools and got excited recognizing me as the developer, which was surreal but also validating. Computer science classes at Stanford were different from high school in every way that mattered. Professors assumed we were all competent and motivated, so there was no need to prove ourselves constantly. The work was challenging enough that even students with significant prior experience had to put in real effort. I ended up in study groups with people who'd been coding since childhood and people who'd only started in high school, and everyone contributed valuable perspectives regardless of their background. The collaborative atmosphere was everything computer science class at Riverside High hadn't been, and I found myself actually enjoying the academic side of programming in a way I hadn't since before Garrett had poisoned that environment. I joined a project team, building an open-source tool for code education, and got to work with a graduate student who'd published research on collaborative learning. The experience reinforced that I'd made the right choice coming to college, rather than diving straight into full-time work. Thanksgiving break, I went home to Oregon and met up with Zara, who was back from RISD for the week. We got coffee at our old spot and spent hours catching up on college life. She showed me photos of her art projects and talked about the intensity of studio classes and the amazing artists she was learning from. I told her about Stanford and CodeBridge's continued growth, and about finally feeling like I was in an environment where I could just focus on building things without constantly defending my right to be there. She said I seemed lighter, less weighed down by the need to prove myself. I told her that distance from high school had given me perspective on how toxic that whole situation had been, that I'd internalized Garrett's assessment of me way more than I'd realized at the time. She said, trauma was like that. It shaped your self-perception even when you knew intellectually that the person hurting you was wrong. We talked about whether we'd do anything differently if we could go back, and I said I would have spoken up sooner instead of trying to endure silently. She said she would have punched Garrett in the face, which made me laugh, even though she was probably half serious. During that same break, I ran into Garrett at a holiday party thrown by a mutual friend from high school. He'd flown back from Carnegie Mellon for Thanksgiving and was telling a group of people about his classes and his roommate and the competitive intensity of his program. When he saw me, he excused himself from that conversation and came over to where I was standing with Zara. He asked how Stanford was and whether I was still working on CodeBridge. I told him about the platform's growth and the classes I was taking, and he shared that Carnegie Mellon was destroying him in the best way possible, that he'd never worked so hard or learned so much. We talked for maybe 15 minutes, just two college freshmen comparing notes on their programs, and it felt remarkably normal. At one point, he mentioned that one of his professors had asked students to share their most important lesson from high school, and he'd talked about learning that being technically skilled wasn't the same as being a good collaborator. He'd explained how he'd spent junior year being an asshole to someone who turned out to be more accomplished than he was, and how that experience had taught him that insecurity masked as confidence was still just insecurity. His professor had apparently appreciated the honesty and used it as a jumping-off point for a discussion about ego in tech culture. The party wound down, and people started heading out. Garrett caught up with me as I was leaving and asked if we could talk for a minute. We stood in the host's driveway in the cold November air while he tried to figure out what he wanted to say. Finally, he told me that he'd spent the past year thinking about how he'd treated me and had come to understand that sorry wasn't really enough for the damage he'd caused. He said he couldn't undo the humiliation or the self-doubt he'd contributed to, but he wanted me to know that watching me succeed, despite his attempts to undermine me, had been humbling in a way he'd needed. He said I'd handled the entire situation with more grace than he would have managed, and he respected that. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I was glad we'd both ended up in places where we were happy and growing. He asked if we could maybe stay in touch as we went through college, not as close friends, but as people who'd learned important lessons from each other. I said I'd be okay with that I believed people could change if they put in the work. We exchanged a brief, awkward hug and went our separate ways. CodeBridge crossed 100,000 active users during my sophomore year at Stanford. Pathfinder Technologies threw a celebration at their office and invited the whole development team, including me, as the founder. The CTO gave a speech about how the platform had exceeded all their initial projections and was genuinely changing how students learned programming. He specifically thanked me for having the vision to build something focused on collaboration rather than competition, saying that philosophy had been key to the product's success. I thought about Garrett's winter project, which had also been impressive but had been built from a mindset of individual achievement rather than collective learning. The difference in approaches had led to different outcomes, and I was proud that CodeBridge represented the values I actually believed in rather than just technical skill. The celebration included a surprise announcement that Pathfinder Technologies was spinning CodeBridge off into its own subsidiary company, and they were offering me a significant equity stake and a position on the board. At 20 years old, I'd be a founder and partial owner of an education technology company, which was surreal to process. My parents flew down for the celebration and kept taking photos of everything like I was graduating again. My mom cried when the CTO announced the company spinoff, and my dad kept asking questions about equity and board responsibilities to make sure I understood what I was agreeing to. Zara sent a video message that they played during the event, congratulating me and joking that she'd always known I was going to be successful, but she'd expected me to be less humble about it. Her words made me think about how I'd almost let Garrett's treatment convince me to hide my abilities and downplay my achievements, how I'd internalized the idea that being good at something was somehow wrong if it made other people uncomfortable. Building CodeBridge had been about proving myself worthy of respect, but it had evolved into something bigger about creating tools that helped other people succeed. That shift from self-focused to community-focused had made the success more meaningful than StreamTask's sale had been. I graduated from Stanford 3 years later with a degree in computer science and a thriving company. CodeBridge had expanded to over 500 schools and had started getting interest from international education systems. Pathfinder Technologies had provided the infrastructure and business support to scale beyond what I could have managed alone, and I'd learned as much from working with their team as I had from my formal education. The company was profitable and growing, and I'd hired a small team of developers who shared my vision for making programming education more accessible. My role had evolved from solo developer to technical leader, which required different skills but felt like a natural progression. I'd learned to balance writing code with managing people and setting strategy, to care about business metrics without losing sight of the product's educational mission. At 22, I felt like I'd built something that mattered and had done it in a way I could be proud of. Garrett and I had stayed in loose contact through college, exchanging occasional messages about interesting projects or career updates. He'd graduated from Carnegie Mellon and taken a job at Google in their Seattle office, working on infrastructure tools. When CodeBridge opened a Seattle satellite office to be closer to West Coast schools, I reached out to see if he wanted to get coffee. We met at a place in Capitol Hill and spent 2 hours talking about our respective jobs and the tech industry and how different real-world development was from academic projects. At one point, I mentioned that CodeBridge was hiring senior engineers for the Seattle team, and he should apply if he was interested in education technology. He looked surprised and asked if I'd actually want to work with him given our history. I said that history was 5 years ago, and we were different people now, that if he was genuinely passionate about the mission and technically qualified, I didn't see why the past should disqualify him. He promised to think about it, and 3 weeks later he submitted an application. The hiring team interviewed him without knowing our connection, and he made it through multiple rounds based purely on his technical skills and cultural fit. When they brought the final decision to me as founder, I reviewed his performance objectively and approved the hire. He started the following month and became one of our strongest contributors, bringing Google-level engineering practices to our growing team. Working together was strange at first, but quickly became normal. Just two professionals collaborating on a shared goal. 5 years after calling me a try-hard in high school, Garrett Finch was helping me build the company that had started as a class project he dismissed as unoriginal. Some forms of justice arrived quietly and years late, but they counted nonetheless. We never explicitly discussed the irony, just focused on building something bigger than either of our egos, which turned out to be the point all along. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.